Halloween had always been one of my favorite holidays, but by senior year in college, it was more of a reason to find a great party. So when my friend Hannah invited me to her sorority's Halloween bash, I was all in. She told me I could bring one friend, so naturally, I picked Alex, my best friend and partner in crime. We were both last minute with costumes every year, and with Alex working late, he asked me to pick something up for him. I swung by the Spirit Halloween store that had popped up down the street, hunting for anything cheap and quick. After scanning the racks, I landed on a Waldo costume for myself and a basic Superman getup for Alex. Just as I was paying, the cashier struck up a conversation. He was an odd-looking guy, thin, with thick glasses and a receding hairline that made it hard to guess if he was 30 or closer to 40. He seemed to perk up when he saw the costumes. "Sounds like you've got a good party planned tonight," he said, giving me this strange grin. "Yeah, my friend's sorority is throwing one," I replied, trying to keep it casual, though I was surprised by how much he seemed to want to know. He pushed a bit further, asking if it was an open invite and if there'd be a lot of girls. When I said it was closed, he looked disappointed, but after a pause, he stuck out his hand. "Name's Jack," he said, gripping my hand with a firm shake. I forced a smile and told him mine, just wanting to get out of there. Walking to my car, I shook off the weird vibe. Probably just a lonely guy, I told myself, trying not to let it get to me. But looking back, I'd later realize that single, uncomfortable interaction would mark the start of one of the longest, creepiest nights of my life. I picked up Alex around 9:30, and by the time we got to the party at 10, it was already in full swing. The sorority house was decked out with Halloween decorations, fake spider webs in every corner, carved pumpkins, and even a strobe light casting creepy shadows against the walls. People crowded every room, all in costumes, red Solo cups in hand. We found Hannah almost right away, and she introduced us to a few of her friends before dragging us into a round of beer pong. Everything felt perfect, a classic college Halloween party with friends, games, and just enough weird costumes to laugh about. We'd been there maybe an hour when we heard yelling by the front door. People were crowding around, looking confused or whispering to each other. Hannah, Alex, and I headed over, trying to see what was happening. At the center of the commotion, a girl I didn't recognize was looking around the room, a nervous expression on her face. "Who's Ryan?" she called out, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on me. I stepped forward, more confused than anything. "I am," I said, glancing at Alex to see if he had any idea what was going on. The girl took a breath, then asked, "Who's the creepy older guy you invited?" It took me a second to even process the question. "What? I didn't invite anyone but Alex," I said. But she shook her head, still looking freaked out. She explained that a man dressed as a cowboy, complete with a fake mustache, had come into the party claiming he was with me. According to her, he'd tried to lead one of the girls into a side room, getting a little too handsy until she screamed for help. That's when he'd bolted, snatching something off a table on his way out. Instantly, I remembered the cashier from Spirit Halloween, Jack. I could feel the color draining from my face as I told Hannah and the girl what had happened at the store earlier. When I mentioned the way he'd asked about the party, the mood shifted. People started looking around, glancing toward the door as if expecting him to walk back in at any moment. Someone suggested calling the cops, and for a second, it seemed like the party might shut down entirely. Eventually, people started to drift back to their groups, but the mood was totally different. Every creak in the house seemed louder, and every knock at the door sent nervous glances toward the entryway. Alex and I tried to shake it off and enjoy ourselves, but the eerie feeling lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about how Jack had seemed harmless, just a weird older guy making small talk. Now the thought of him lurking around the party felt downright sinister. By midnight, Alex and I were both ready to call it a night. We said our goodbyes to Hannah and slipped out into the cool October air, walking back to my car in silence, each of us too unsettled to really say much. We didn't know it yet. But the night was far from over. As soon as I started my car, headlights flicked on from a car a few spots back. At first, I thought nothing of it. But after I made a few turns, it was still there, following every move. I glanced at Alex, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It's gotta be him," I said, voice low. Alex nodded, tension visible in his clenched jaw. I decided to test it, pulling off to the side of the road, waiting to see if he'd stop too. The car slowed, pausing just long enough for us to feel his eyes watching us. Then he sped up, tires squealing as he roared past us, and disappeared into the night. Dropping Alex off, we tried to laugh it off, like maybe we were making it worse than it was. But neither of us really believed that. After I left Alex, I kept checking my mirrors as I drove home. My heart nearly stopped when, after a few blocks, I noticed a car again, far enough back to keep me guessing, but close enough that I couldn't ignore it. Its headlights were off, lurking in the darkness as it trailed me. I couldn't see the driver, but I had this awful feeling in my gut. I was sure it was him. I pulled over a second time, hoping to scare him off. After a few agonizing seconds, the car sped up and passed me again, its headlights snapping on as it rushed by. I didn't dare look over at him, barely breathing until I was sure he'd gone. I made it home and double-checked my locks before finally sinking into bed, but sleep didn't come easy. That night, I kept imagining him out there, lurking, waiting. The next morning, I called the Spirit Halloween store, reporting Jack and explaining what had happened. They thanked me, promising to look into it, but they never followed up, and I never went back to that store, to this day. I wonder what he wanted or how far he might have gone if I hadn't noticed him tailing us. Every Halloween since. Whenever I see a cowboy costume, my stomach clenches. The memory of that night creeping back. That cashier Jack was never just a lonely guy looking for conversation. He was something else, something dangerous. And even though he never found out where I live, I can't shake the feeling that someday he'll find me again. Halloween isn't a big deal here in Australia, but I've been obsessed with it for as long as I can remember. Every year, I'm the one putting up decorations and setting up our candy bowl, even though we barely get 5 kids at the door. My parents think it's silly, but they let me do my thing. That year, Halloween fell on a school night, and as luck would have it, a storm rolled in around 6, scattering the few kids who were actually out. I was disappointed, but I'd resigned myself to a quiet night watching Asterisk, The Conjuring Asterisk, and snacking on candy. I'd probably end up eating myself. The movie was hitting one of its scariest parts when my phone buzzed with a message. It was our group chat, and my friend M had sent a surprising idea: trick-or-treating, just like we used to when we were kids. I laughed at the thought. It had been years since we last went out like that. The others in the group, S, C, and H, were in too, excited to revive our old tradition for one night. But then, almost immediately, M messaged again, saying something had come up and he couldn't make it. Instead, he told us about a particular house nearby, one that always had tons of candy. We all figured it was just some random house that left out a bowl for anyone brave enough to show up in the storm. So we decided to go anyway, more for the thrill than the candy. Within 20 minutes, we'd all gathered at the end of my street, armed with flashlights and ponchos against the rain, ready for one last spontaneous Halloween adventure. The house looked even creepier up close. A small, worn-down place with peeling paint and a faint smell of mildew in the air. A single carved pumpkin sat on the porch, grinning at us with a lopsided smile. In front of it, a big orange bowl filled with lollipops waited, almost like it was daring us to come closer. The windows were dark, and there was no sign of anyone inside. We looked around to make sure no one was watching, and then grabbed a few handfuls each. Giggling as we filled our bags, we'd barely turned to leave when I noticed something shifting in the shadows at the edge of the yard. 2 figures stepped forward slowly, emerging from behind the trees. They were dressed as clowns, one tall and lanky, the other stockier, with both of their faces painted in wide, exaggerated smiles that looked almost like they'd been stretched too far, their heads tilted at the same unnatural angle. eyes fixed right on us. One of my friends gasped, breaking the silence. And that's when the clowns started running. Their footsteps pounded the wet grass, one of them squeaking a rubber nose as they sprinted toward us. We didn't wait to see what would happen if they caught up. We bolted, racing down the street as fast as we could, slipping on the rain-soaked pavement. I could hear my heart pounding as we cut through alleys and dashed behind houses, ducking under fences and trying to lose them. Every time I looked back, I thought I saw one of them, just a few yards behind us. Always getting closer. After what felt like an eternity, we finally stopped in a dark alley, panting and out of breath. Our faces were pale, and no one said a word. We decided the safest place to go was M's house. If he'd sent us to that house, he needed to know what we'd just escaped from. By the time we reached M's front door, our clothes were soaked, and we were all still shaking. We knocked loudly, praying he'd open the door right away. When M finally answered, he looked at us in total confusion. "What's wrong with you guys?" He laughed, taking in our terrified expressions. One of my friends, still catching his breath, yelled, "You told us to go to that house and those clowns chased us." M's smile faded and his brows furrowed as he shook his head. I didn't message anyone. My phone's been missing since this afternoon. The realization hit us like a slap in the face. Someone else had messaged us, using M's phone. By the time I got home, my nerves were shot, but I tried to shake it off. I watched the rest of Asterisk, The Conjuring Asterisk, the usual scares now barely fazing me after what we'd just been through. When the credits rolled, I went to collect the candy bowl from the porch, expecting it to be mostly full since hardly any kids had shown up. But the bowl was empty. At first, I thought my parents must have taken some candy, but then I noticed it. A single red clown nose resting at the bottom of the bowl. My stomach dropped and a chill ran through me. I rushed to show my parents, but they just shrugged it off, telling me it was just some prank and that Halloween always brings out the weirdos. I knew it wasn't just a prank, but they brushed it off, leaving me more on edge than ever. I tried to sleep that night, but every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should. Then, around 1 a.m, I woke to a soft tapping sound against my window. Tap, tap, tap. I lay there frozen, heart pounding, but eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I crept to the window, pulling the blinds aside just enough to peek through. Outside, the Halloween decorations I'd carefully set up were ripped to shreds, scattered across the lawn. My stomach twisted with fear as something small and round hit the window. A lollipop. That's when I looked up and saw them. Perched on my neighbor's roof, backlit by the streetlight, were the two clowns from the house. They sat side by side, painted faces tilted down toward me, watching, grinning. As I stared, too terrified to move, they raised their hands in slow, exaggerated waves, like they were saying goodnight. I let out a scream and ran to my parents' room, tears streaming down my face as I tried to explain. They called the police, but by the time officers arrived, the clowns had vanished. The next morning, the police updated us. They'd investigated the house where we'd trick-or-treated. It was abandoned, they said, and they'd found M's missing phone inside, lying on the floor near the candy bowl we'd emptied. That day at school, my friends shared their own terrifying encounters from that night. Taps on windows, shadowy figures moving outside, eerie laughter just beyond their doors. We all felt watched, haunted, and with Halloween just days away again. I can't shake the feeling those clowns might return, their painted smiles knowing exactly where each of us lives. It was Halloween night, and the storm outside felt like something out of an old horror movie. Sheets of rain crashed against the windows, and every now and then, lightning would blaze across the sky, lighting up the room just long enough to cast eerie shadows. Thunder rumbled low, making the whole house shiver. I was hanging out with my friends, John, Mary, and Keenan. We didn't have any real plans, just trying to kill time. So I thought it would be funny to grab the old Ouija board I'd buried in my closet. It was a hand-me-down from my aunt, one she'd warned me about with a joking but serious look. "Don't go inviting anything in," she'd said, and I'd laughed it off. I'd barely touched it since then. When I brought it out, my friend's eyes lit up. Everyone was down to give it a shot, so I set the mood by lighting 3 candles and turning off all the lights. It made the whole room feel different. Shadows swayed on the walls, and the candles flickered as if something was already watching. We all sat around the table, our hands on the planchette. We started with the basics, keeping it light. "Is anyone there?" I asked, half expecting silence. But the planchette shifted immediately, gliding to yes. We laughed, figuring someone was messing around. Mary's eyes were wide, and John and Keenan grinned, clearly enjoying how on edge she looked. We asked a bunch of silly questions. "Will you haunt Mary?" And "Are you a friendly ghost?" Every answer spelled out yes, sending us all into fits of laughter. Then, just as I was about to ask another goofy question, the planchette started moving on its own, like it had its own agenda. It slid, letter by letter, spelling something new. "I'm inside the house." We all froze, our laughter dying out in an instant. And then, as if to confirm it wasn't a joke, an unmistakable thump echoed from directly above us. It sounded like someone had stomped a heavy boot on the floor right above our heads. We stumbled back from the table, all of us startled. Mary let out a sharp scream and kept shaking her head, saying she didn't want to play anymore. Her eyes flickered between the ceiling and the Ouija board, desperate to leave. Keenan and John tried to play it cool, sharing an uneasy laugh, but I could see the tension in their faces. I felt it too, that tight, cold dread gnawing at me. My parents were out for the night, and there was no one else in the house, no one, that is, who could have been stomping around upstairs. We sat in silence, each of us processing what had just happened. And when the doorbell rang, breaking the silence like a thunderclap, we all jumped, staring at each other with wide eyes. I forced myself to stand, heart pounding, and walk to the front door. Peeking through the peephole, I let out a nervous laugh. It was just a dad and his young son, trick-or-treating in the storm. I opened the door, grabbed a handful of candy, and dropped it into the boys' bag. But as soon as I closed the door, that creeping dread washed over me again, stronger than before. "Let's check upstairs," I whispered, more to convince myself than the others. No one seemed thrilled, but finally they nodded. We crept up the staircase, every step creaking in the silence. The only light came from a faint nightlight plugged into the hallway wall, casting long shadows that stretched and shifted with each step. We reached the top of the stairs and froze, listening, our breaths shallow. And that's when we heard it, a soft, whispering voice floating from my parents' bedroom at the end of the hall. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakably the voice of a young girl. We couldn't make out the words, just the slow, deliberate cadence, each syllable chilling us to the bone. Then, another loud thud, like something heavy being dropped onto the floor. That was enough for Mary and Keenan. Without a word, they turned and ran down the stairs, their footsteps pounding in frantic beats. John and I shared a look, terrified, but too proud to bolt. Taking shallow breaths, we edged down the hallway until we were right outside my parents' bedroom door. I could barely hear anything over my racing heartbeat. My hand shook as I reached for the door handle, feeling the cold metal under my fingers. I turned it slowly, and the door creaked as I nudged it open. The room was swallowed in darkness, but in the far corner, something tall and shadowy stood, looming silently, as if it had been waiting for us. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just watched. I don't know who moved first. Maybe me, maybe John. But the next second, the door slammed shut and we were bolting down the stairs, not stopping until we were back in the living room, every light flicked on, huddled together with our backs pressed against the wall. We didn't stop running until we reached the living room, flipping on every light as we went, as if the brightness could keep whatever we'd seen upstairs from following. Out of breath and clinging to each other in the lit-up room, we finally felt a sliver of safety. until I noticed something that made my stomach drop. One of the 3 candles we'd lit beside the Ouija board had gone out. The wick snuffed to a cold, dark nub. The windows were shut, and there hadn't been a single draft. That was it. We were done. I grabbed my phone and called the cops, trying to explain the strange noises and shadows in as calm a voice as I could. When the officer arrived, he seemed skeptical but polite, and I led him upstairs, pointing out my parents' bedroom door. He knocked, announced himself, and then opened it with a brisk motion, flicking on the light. We all waited, breath held. As he checked the closet, under the bed, every inch of the room, while John and I peered in from the hallway, there was nothing. I couldn't believe it. So I followed him inside, sweeping my gaze across every corner we'd already checked. The shadow was gone, as if it had melted into the darkness. Whatever had been there before had vanished without a trace. The officer assured us the house was clear before he left, but his tone told me he thought we'd just scared ourselves into a frenzy. When he was gone, I grabbed the Ouija board, barely able to look at it, and marched it outside, tossing it straight into the neighbor's garbage bin, just to get it out of the house. We sat under the awning in my backyard, huddled together in silence, listening to the storm pound against the roof, flinching at every clap of thunder. By the time my parents came home, the whole thing felt unreal. Telling them the story felt more like a scene from a bad horror movie, but I could see the worry in their eyes as we described everything that had happened. They believed us, at least a little, but what could they do? That night, I lay in bed, every creak and shadow around me pulling my mind back to the image of that tall figure in the corner, silently watching us. The words spelled out on the board echoed in my mind. I'm inside the house. I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, my mind replaying every unsettling detail. And one thing is for sure, I'm never touching a Ouija board again.